There's something comforting about our return to the familiar Torah portions of Genesis. The creation narrative, the Garden of Eden, and now this week, Noah's Ark. Fodder for silly camp songs and beloved childhood storybooks, the righteous Noah is tasked by God to build a wooden ark in order to save two animals of every kind from the floodwaters sent to wipe out life across the planet. This tale is not unique to the Jewish canon, but similar stories were told by other ancient cultures. One example is the Epic of Gilgamesh's Great Deluge, a story of a great flood sent by the gods to wipe out humanity, begin creation anew. According to Gilgamesh, the gods were troubled by the growth of humankind in both number and power, and were unimpressed by the people's tendency to misbehave. Similarly, that is part of our Torah's reasoning for the flood as well. As we read in Genesis, God observed the earth was full of violence and full of corruption. So God would punish the people by sending a great flood. That's when God warns Noah to build the ark in order to save his family and the animals. You know that story well. However, I want to offer a different perspective on this well-known text. I don't want to focus on the evildoers or the righteous Noah or even the animals. This year, I want to lift up what this week's Torah portion reveals about God, and in turn, what could be possible for each of us as we try to navigate our lives today. The childhood storybook's telling of Noah's Ark often ends when the floodwaters recede and Noah observes a rainbow painted across the sky. However, in Torah, the dialogue between God and Noah continues after everyone disembarks the ark. After the flood, God speaks to Noah, promising never again to destroy every living being. You might see this as a change of heart, but reading further, we find that God's reasoning to never again flood the earth is precisely the reason Torah gives for why God sent the flood in the first place. As one modern commentator puts it, whereas Genesis 6 suggests that God floods the earth because of humanity's sinfulness, Genesis 8 tells us that God commits never to flood the earth again because of humanity's sinfulness. The reason for God sending one flood has now mysteriously become the reason for God not sending another. Rabbi Shai Held teaches the very same shortcomings that had called forth doom and denunciation now elicit forbearance and generosity instead. What has changed is not who and what the Israelites are. They remain just as sinful as before. What has changed, rather, is how God views the same persistent human failure. And therein lies this week's lesson about God, God's capacity to move from judgment to mercy and compassion, the ability to see the people's actions through the lens of rachamim, compassion, rather than din, judgment. That tension between compassion and judgment is reflected throughout Jewish tradition. We need only think back a few weeks to the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah, a day referred to as Yom Hadin, Judgment Day, the day we are to take account of our behaviors during the past year, praying we are worthy to live another. The judge, the Machzor reminds us, is God. So, fearful and trembling, we turn to God during the Unatana Tokef prayer to plead for God's compassion for a new year of health and sweetness. The sages remind us that we must strive to be on our best behavior every day, and not just during the High Holy Day season. But recognizing we are but human and frequently miss the mark, Talmud imagines that God has a daily practice of cultivating compassion for us. According to a 3rd century rabbi, God sits every day and judges the entire world. Once God sees that the world has rendered itself liable to destruction, God arises from the throne of judgment and sits on the throne of mercy, and the world is not destroyed. Elsewhere, we read of God's great love and compassion for humankind, imperfect and flawed as we are. The Talmud conveys a touching story of how God even defends humanity's shortcomings to the angels. When the Holy One, blessed be God, came to create human beings, God created a group of ministering angels and asked them, "Do you agree that we should make human beings in our image?" They replied, "Sovereign of the universe, what will be their deeds?" So God showed them the history of humankind. The angels replied, "What is human that you are mindful of them? In other words, let humans not be created." God destroyed those angels and created a second group and asked them the same question, and they gave God the same answer. So God destroyed them too. God created a third group of angels, and they replied, "Sovereign of the universe, the first and second group of angels told you not to create humans, and it didn't avail them. You didn't listen. What then can we say? But this is your universe. Do with it as you wish." God created humans. When it came to the generation of the flood, those evildoers, the angels said to God, "Were not the first angels right? See how great is this corruption that humans have caused." God replied, "Even to old age, I will not change. Even to gray hair, I will still be patient with them." Our God is a compassionate one, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. So what then should we, humans created in the divine image, take from all of this? Surely there is more room for compassion these days. Compassion for ourselves as we each do our best to navigate life during the ongoing pandemic. And more poignant now, roughly 1 week until the national election, I want to lift up the opportunity for each of us to practice more compassion for others, particularly others with whom we disagree along political lines, those with whom we disagree on particular issues, those who vote differently than we do. I've witnessed seemingly irreparable rifts form between family members and friends in these weeks, vitriol, dangerous anger, and intolerance for those with whom we disagree. I fear for our future. You've heard me say it before, we must turn away from the coarseness, indecency, and lack of respect for the other that characterizes so much of our political discourse. We must, as a nation, remember that we are supposed to care about each other, about one another's struggles, our pains, and our losses. For we are a people created in the likeness of a compassionate God. We must act like it. That is one of the important messages of this week's Torah portion. Beyond the ark and the animals, a deeper look at the tale of Noah's Ark invites us to live with greater compassion, more appreciation for God's miracles. As one Christian scholar reminds us, humanity remains undeserving of the gift of manageable life in a regular world order, but the gift is given nonetheless. God's forbearance, rightly understood, should lead not to complacency, but to the living of life in a way that recognizing its quality as gift. In appreciation, we must strive to walk in God's ways, that of love and compassion, understanding we each possess growing edges and opportunities for growth, and regardless, striving to demonstrate our worthiness of God's compassion and faithfulness. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may our actions merit that coming true. Shabbat Shalom.